New Thought Media Network is pleased to present The Inclusive Church, Ideas and Resources for Leaders of Multicultural Ministries. The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Tuesdays at 12 noon Mountain Time. Join Tracy and her guests as they go deep and share practical tips and resources you can use in your ministry. And now let's explore the Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Inclusive Church on New Thought Media Network. My name is Tracy Brown and I am the founder of and author of Stained Glass Spirit, building a spiritual community where oneness does not require sameness. And this focus on building and sustaining and expanding an inclusive ministry is what we're all about on this show. So I'm so glad that you have joined in today, either live or by watching the recording. And if you are watching live, I would love it if you would just say hello or say where you are watching from. I can see that we have viewers on YouTube and 3 different Facebook pages and even someone on LinkedIn. So you're not required to say hello, but feel free to say hello. And throughout the show today, feel free to put comments or questions in the chat or in the comment section, because I will be watching for them. And if it's a question, I will do my best to weave a response into whatever it is I'm talking about. Today, the focus is on preparing your members for being inclusive and for loving the experience that they're having, being inclusive. And hey, Anita, how are you today? So glad you joined in. So, I find it really interesting that in our spiritual communities and in churches and in, ministries that are not limited to, a physical building, that there are individual leaders, sometimes the minister and sometimes not, but they're individual leaders who get it, right? Who get why it's important to be inclusive of all different kinds of people. And it's fascinating to me that often these leaders think one of two things, almost at either ends of a spectrum. That many of them think, well, because I get it, everybody else should. And I'm just going to drive this. I'm going to drive this just by the sheer force of my own passion. And then there are a lot of leaders who are like, but I'm only one person. I am passionate about this and I think it's important, but not many people are talking about it, so I'm just going to be quiet too. And neither one of those approaches really works unless you have a very, very, very tiny, small ministry, which is fine, because then maybe as you grow the ministry, right, it's been baked in from the very beginning. But in general, people don't find the happy medium by accident. So my job is to help you find the happy medium intentionally. And I think one of the most important things is really to prepare your members. So let me backtrack for 2 minutes. In case you were watching Inclusive Church for the very first time, I do need to define a couple of things. So when I say leader, I am not just talking about the minister or the senior minister or the person who's in charge of the ministry. I am saying everyone who is engaged, who is leading a team, who is coordinating a project or event, everyone who is tithing or giving a significant amount of money into a ministry. They are all, or potentially all, the leaders I am speaking to and about. That's number one. Number two, the title of the show and the soon to be released book is The Inclusive Church or Inclusive Churches. And the subtitle is Ideas and Resources for Multicultural Ministries. So when I say church, I am not talking about a building. I'm not talking about, a certain structure with a steeple or a bell. I'm saying the church is the collection of people. And if we didn't know that, or if we had forgotten that before 2020, the pandemic, not just in my local town, but globally, right? The pandemic reminded us that the church is not the physical location, the church is the people. So the ministry is the people. Even if you are completely virtual, the church or the congregation, and you can call them other names, but for me to be able to reach and relate to the widest number of people, I ended up coming back to the word church. And so I do want to define that: church, ministry, leaders, who I'm talking to. Okay, diving back in. So today's focus on prepare your members is the way that you move from one end of the spectrum into the middle where the masses are. But you can't assume that just because you are very passionate about it, your members will be. Oh, the stories I could tell you about individual ministers or leaders who were shocked when they were so passionate about being more inclusive, and they had members leave their community. They had members who challenged them after a service or event, saying they were being political instead of spiritual. They had people that had been in their communities for decades walking away or complaining, and they were shocked. So I don't want you to be shocked, and I want you to do some things that are proactive that will keep you from imploding this community of people who you love. Evelyn, I'm so glad that you've joined in today as well. Feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat. So when we think about this whole idea of preparing your members, it is not just a practical thing to do. I think it is a necessity. It is a requirement if you truly want to be inclusive. And when I'm talking about being inclusive, I'm talking about all the ways that we are different from one another, not just race, right? Not just gender. And so we have an opportunity to apply this to all different kinds of aspects of the ways that people and groups of people may find challenging to deal with if they are interacting with or working on a team with someone who is, or a whole group of people who are very different from them in significant ways. So I love this quote by Rosalind Carter. A leader takes people where they want to go, but a great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go, but ought to be. A leader takes people where they want to go. But a great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go, but ought to be. And we do this in a lot of ways in our spiritual communities. We're educating people about spiritual principle, and they may not exactly know where that's going to take them, but we lead them there, we guide them there, and we're often very strategic in how we ramp people up to a certain level of knowledge. We understand that at the beginning, when they first come to visit our New Thought spiritual community, that they may know some things, but they really probably don't understand the complexity of whatever the spiritual philosophy or spiritual principles are. And so we make sure that we have a foundations course or a member orientation or a, here are the basics, not calling them beginners like in a remedial way, but we give them information and we ask them to apply it, and then we introduce them to more spiritual practices, and then we build on those spiritual practices in a different way, right? We do that consciously and intentionally when we are thinking about teaching spiritual practice or spiritual principle. But we forget that understanding and applying a commitment to inclusion is the same thing. And so as leaders, we can take people where they want to go. Hey, I want to learn new thought. Fabulous. But when we take them to where we know they ought to be, which is not just knowing new thought spiritual principles, but understanding them and then applying them. We have to do the same thing if we want to be successful. So for me, when I think about preparing members to be a part of, an active part of an inclusive church, I think there are 4 things that I'm going to highlight. I think there are a lot of things, but there are 4 things that I think as leaders we must highlight in a conscious, practical, and intentional way. I would even say in a strategic way, but in a conscious and intentional way is what I want to share with you. So, number 1 of 4, when you are talking about diversity and inclusion, it is critical that you identify some of the issues and many of the opportunities. Some of the issues and the opportunities. So what happens a lot of the time when I've talked to different leaders, what's happened is I'll ask them, so I'm just curious, what have you done with the members in your community to get them to want to engage around inclusion or to recognize the value of diversity? And unfortunately, 90% maybe of the time, a lot of the time, what leaders play back to me is, well, I tell them about, all of the people who don't have what they have, and that's a problem because everybody should have access to everything. Or I tell them, or, we got really involved in our church around this, because there were so many Black men being killed. And we thought that was just horrible. And so we felt we needed to, really dig into this and pray for people and be part of the solution. Or they will respond to me something like, well, we have a lot of people who identify as LGBTQ plus, and we want to be on the fight for their civil rights. All of those are really good and valid reasons to begin to recognize diversity and to be committed to inclusion. However, you also want to be telling people about the opportunities, that what are the benefits of being committed to inclusion for them individually, as well as for your spiritual community, as well as for the community metropolitan area you live in, or for the nation. We spend so much time talking about the problems that we have to fix. It's no surprise that people get in their minds that diversity is about discrimination, that is only about discrimination. Valuing diversity is only about the tension, and it's fixing and making any tension go away without recognizing all the opportunities. Wow, if I learn about and understand different cultures, number one, I don't get triggered when things happen or when people do or say things. Number two, it expands me. Number three, I get to see and understand much more about the way God shows up in humanity than I can know just by understanding my own culture. I mean, like, don't get me started. I'll, go for the next 30 minutes about the opportunities and the benefits. But the point is this, that it is critical for you to talk about the opportunities as much, or I would say more than, the issues, the challenges. Related to that is tip number two. Tip number two is not only looking at the issues and the opportunities, but focusing on the faith mandate. Focusing on the faith mandate. One of the reasons that so many people are hesitant to support inclusive activities or a commitment to inclusion in spiritual communities is because they don't understand how it has anything to do with their faith or their belief system, their spiritual principles, because nobody's ever told them. No one's brought them together with, here is what we teach, and this is why we are committed in this church or in this community to take these three actions. So for your community, you may have to develop your own list, but in many spiritual communities and many New Thought communities, since we're on the New Thought Media Network today, for many New Thought communities, it's easy to say, well, we believe in and we teach oneness. And because of oneness, we must make sure that everyone is treated fairly. And you have to be careful with this, because what I'm continuing to learn is that different people have different definitions for oneness, which the subtitle of the Stained Glass Spirit book, Communities Where Oneness Does Not Require Sameness. But still, there are many people that when they say oneness, they are meaning there is no such thing as diversity. That's only like a human made up concept. There is no diversity, and we're all one, we're all the same. And so that's not actually factually true. So you may have to have some conversations if you are going to use oneness as a spiritual grounding. But there are many spiritual principles or attributes of the universe, attributes of God that you can use to have conversations about being inclusive. You can use Jesus as the example, right? Not as the exception. And you can build in, when you are talking about inclusion, examples that were set. It's really important, if you want people in your community to move beyond the idea of diversity and inclusion being political, that you draw the roadmap for them on why your spiritually based community is mandated. Mandated. It's not a word that I would be afraid to use. Our spiritual teaching, because we believe in X, Y, and Z, requires us to not turn our backs on these kinds of things. Or in a proactive way, our spiritual teachings are an imperative, give us an imperative to build harmony in the world, to be the example of love, especially with people who are different from ourselves. Not because, oh, poor them, we're going to come and be their savior, but because we want to live in a world where this is how everyone lives. We are about creating heaven on earth. And heaven, if you go to the 12th chapter of Revelations, right, there's the scripture around people from all tribes coming together. And even though they are all wearing white robes, they are representing the languages and customs and cultures of so many different tribes all come together. And if you in your spiritual community don't refer to the Bible a lot, there are, I was going to say dozens, but there are hundreds of examples that you can use from other readings about people coming together to build a world together. And not just from a place of rights or equity, but from a place of respect and love. So for me, the three qualities or attributes of God I tend to go back to over and over again are love, harmony, and unity. Love, harmony, and unity from a spiritual perspective. And so I often have to define what I mean when I'm saying those words. And but then bringing in scripture or quotations or stories and parables or examples. And when I do that, and when I get people talking about it from that perspective, they are the ones that begin telling me, oh, well, if I'd understood it this way before, I would be taking these actions. Because another thing that you want to always do is you want to get people to translate their thinking into actions. Now, here's the hard part. When people start translating their thinking about this and their positive intention about this into their actions, then all of a sudden they're having conversations with people they've never had before, and that they get afraid they're going to say something wrong. Or they're having conversations with people they wouldn't have talked to before, or people they've known for a long time, but they've never talked about the challenges or the opportunities related to valuing diversity. And they don't know what to say. Or the person they're talking to brings up something and they're like, right? And they freeze, or they go into lockdown because it's hard. I had a conversation a number of years ago with a friend who had been who had participated in an event, and this was quite a while ago. It was after Trayvon Martin had been killed, and this friend had participated in an event and listened to some Black women talk about how afraid they were for their sons. And one particular woman who my friend had known for a long time, when she shared her personal anxiety and her personal concerns, and they could actually relate to it because they had known this Black woman for so long. They were like sharing with me, as someone who is white, I kind of knew in theory stuff was happening, but I didn't think it was happening to people I know, right? People who have good jobs, people who I know are doing a good job raising their family, people who come to my church, people who I've seen, grow up, and I've eaten their food, and I've done right, like somebody I care about. Actually, it goes through the world, goes through life every day afraid that these things that I read about in the news are that real and present. And my friend and I talked about how difficult it was to have the conversation, not only process the information, but wow, I don't know what to say. And I don't know who else I can talk to about. So the third tip for preparing your members is to actually demonstrate and provide very intentional opportunities to move from lip service to liberating heart talk. Most people still in 2024 do not have this skill. Let me say that again. In 2024, more people than ever before have some skill, but most people do not have the skill. They have been doing lip service to inclusion for their entire adult life. We could say their entire life, but I'm not going to hold people accountable for what they did as children. But for their adult life, they've given lip service to it. But then when you start having and you start modeling, talking about these subjects clearly and without apology, it requires or it will result in people in your community, your members also, beginning to have some real hard talk. And you have to give them the skills. You must provide the training because they're not necessarily going to learn it anywhere else. And so, I'm aware of a number of communities that are doing a lot of things that are helpful and that are laying the foundation and that are teaching people to talk about tough, difficult subjects. And it's not easy. And the other thing, and I'm just laughing a little bit because, Evelyn, I know that you know this, but it requires repetition and it requires patience. It requires repetition and it requires patience. It means you have to give people settings. That could be, you could be doing book studies, or it could be that you have once a quarter meetings where you talk about the center or the church's commitment and what that means. It means that from the platform or the podium, if you are someone who is speaking on a regular basis, that you have to integrate examples into your talks of how you are working on the hard talk, the hard conversations, because that gives people a model as well as permission to stumble and to make mistakes. But it's the leader's job. Now, let's say you're not the minister and you're not speaking and you are the leader of a ministry team. Let's say you're the leader of the team of greeters, ushers, the people who welcome visitors and community members on Sunday, and you're that leader. Then yeah, when you do have meetings and when you are creating your orientation and onboarding for new members to your team, and at least 4 or 5 times a year, if you have a little meeting or you call people together, even if it's on Zoom, and you actually remind them, oh, and you can probably use real life examples. Are we greeting people in a way that is representative of our commitment to inclusion? Or when you see someone you've known for the last 8 years, you're really excited to see them and you hug them and you're like, oh. And then someone who's new to the community, maybe only a couple of months, or today is their first day, when they walk up, you're like, oh, hi, welcome. But they don't get the hug and the excitement. You've got to have a hard conversation about that. And people will be uncomfortable. So practicing how to do that is what begins to turn the community into one that is inclusive. But many people in the community must have the skill of moving from lip service to liberating hard talk. And the fourth tip that I want to share with you is make it real. Make it real. Make this commitment to inclusion real. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's not a theory. It's not a philosophy. It's not just something that, oh, we want to be inclusive, because you'll still be wanting to be inclusive a year from now, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now. Make it real. Use real examples of what you are doing and what you are changing. Use examples from the last 30 days of something you personally did as a leader or something that happened in your community. Both the successes and the not so much success that you're learning from. Because I don't think it's a failure, right? I just think it's, whoops, right? We didn't think about that, or we didn't catch ourselves around that. But we got some feedback. And here's what we're going to do with that feedback. I will never forget the day that a group of us who are often called on for prayer in my home spiritual community, and we came together and we got some feedback that there was someone who had been a part of our community actually at that point for almost a year, and they had come over for after service prayer several weeks in a row. And this was a person who is transgender and was in the early stages of that process of making a transition from presenting as one gender to another. And I, along with I think just about everyone else who was in that meeting was surprised to get the feedback that this person had been offended because everyone who had prayed with and for them referred to them using the pronoun she. Now, this congregant mistakenly assumed that everyone knew that they were using the pronoun he or they. We didn't know that. And by appearance, as you can imagine, most of us saw visually someone who appeared female. So it was an example of both tip 3 and 4. One, it made it real because this was someone right here in my community. And it also forced us to go from lip service to having some real liberating heart talk, because we had conversation that day that was really uncomfortable for so many people who were in the room about, well, how would we know? And I didn't know. And I wouldn't do anything to disrespect someone, but I had no clue. Well, has this congregant, who has this congregant told? Well, that doesn't matter, but the congregant hasn't told me, so how would I know? And that led to some hard and liberating talk about it's my responsibility, each one of us, when someone sits in front of us for prayer or coaching, or really just even a conversation in the fellowship hall at lunch or after an event, that I cannot assume. I cannot assume. And I don't have to feel bad or guilty if I get it wrong, because I did assume. However, the next time I have another chance to either introduce myself saying, hey, I'm Tracy and my pronouns are she and her, or to ask certain questions that will allow that person to talk about themselves in a way that I may pick up on something like that if I don't feel comfortable asking directly. And, it is a little, I will say, in this particular example, it's a little challenging because, of course, this was someone who'd been in our community for almost a year. And, it's not someone you're meeting for the first time where you could say, hey, what's your name? And what are your pronouns? So have liberating heart talk, make it real. Also make it real about the successes you are having. So again, I'll use my home community. And a couple of years ago, when we decided that we wanted to build skills related to talking about race and racism, we developed an 18-hour, 6-module educational program. And so we didn't talk a whole lot about it while it was going on, but it was very successful and people in the community were talking about it. And so we have used it a number of times as a make it real example of the commitment that leaders have in our community. And we've used some of the examples of the difficult conversations that came up during the course of going through those 6 modules where people were surprised. But it's real because it happened right in our own community, and people can relate to the leaders who went through this process. So let me remind you of the 4 tips that you want to use to prepare your members to be committed to and to be examples of an inclusive church or ministry, right? So we'll go backwards. Number 4, make it real. Number 3, move from lip service to liberating hard talk on the platform and away from the platform. Number 2, focus on the faith mandate. Even if you are in a community that has been actively engaged in supporting and growing a commitment to inclusion for a long time, make sure that you are frequently going back and reminding people that this is the seed for all of this comes from the faith system that you teach and that you believe and that you practice, because it only takes one big news story for people to all of a sudden be hearing all kinds of things in the media and slip into the human, predictable human perception that, why is my church being so political? We need to separate politics from spirituality. That's a whole nother conversation, because I grew up in a church that understood anytime you have people and you care about people, you must care about the issues that affect people, that help them have a great life, or that hinder their progress. But many folks in New Thought communities did not grow up in that type of environment and believe, right? They have a long-standing belief that there should be a demarcation, a brick wall, a wall that cannot be, it doesn't have any view holes in it. It's a brick wall with politics on one side and spirituality and on the other. And so you are the ones as leaders that have to continuously ensure that people are being reminded or educated on the faith mandate. And then the first tip was to identify both issues and opportunities. Issues and opportunities. So those are the 4 tips that I have for you today related to preparing your members to not put you as a leader as the only one who is talking about the importance of inclusion. You don't want to be as a leader of a team or the leader of the entire ministry. You do not want to be the only one who is speaking to and giving an example. You must set an example. This is true, but you don't want to be the only one doing so. So that's what I want to kind of just drop into your consciousness today, as it relates to preparing your members. What's coming up on Inclusive Church in the next couple of weeks is I'm going to have some guests with me. Last week, you may have been with me when I had Reverend Karen Lindsley with me. Next week, I'll be talking with Reverend Abigail Scherer from Seattle, Washington, and she's going to share some of the very cool things that they have done that you might want to try or practice, or that you might learn from. And the week after that, I'll be visiting with Reverend Dr. Michelle Medrano from Lakewood, Colorado. And in the meantime, I encourage you to visit stainedglassspirit.net or Stained Glass Spirit on Facebook, where throughout the month I put different quotations or links to articles and ideas and resources that you can use to demonstrate your commitment to inclusion. That's it for the show today. I'm so glad that you joined us. Thank you so much. And I will see you next Tuesday at 12 noon Mountain Time, right here on the New Thought Media Network.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.